Margaret O'Sullivan wiped the sweat from her forehead as she struggled to lift the heavy water bucket from the well. At 28, she had grown accustomed to the whispers that followed her through the small frontier town of Clearwater Springs. Her frame was larger than most women, her hands calloused from work that should have belonged to a husband she never had. The other women in town would lower their voices when she passed, but she still caught their words like thorns. Poor thing. She'll never find a man. Who would want to marry someone like that? She's strong as an ox, but that's not what men want in a wife. Margaret had stopped listening to their cruelty years ago, but it still stung when young Tommy would ask why he didn't have a father like the other children. Tommy was 6 now, with sandy hair and eyes the color of summer sky. He had been left on her doorstep 3 years ago with nothing but a note that read, "Please care for him. His mother cannot." No name, no explanation, just a scared little boy who clung to her skirts and called her mama within a week. The general store owner, Mr. Henley, had suggested she place the boy in an orphanage. "You're not equipped to raise a child alone, Margaret, especially not with your circumstances." He had gestured vaguely at her body, his meaning clear. But Margaret had looked down at Tommy's trusting face and knew she would rather die than give him up. She ran a small boarding house at the edge of town, taking in travelers and workers who needed a clean bed and hot meal. The work was hard, but it kept them fed and housed. She cooked, cleaned, mended, and hauled water for 8 rooms, often working from before dawn until well past midnight. Her hands were rough. Her back ached constantly, and she had to let out her dresses twice since Tommy arrived, because stress and hard work had made her even heavier. On this particular afternoon, as she hung wet clothes on the line behind the boarding house, she noticed a man approaching from the direction of the Apache reservation. He was tall and lean, with dark skin weathered by sun and wind. His black hair hung in 2 braids down his back, and he wore a mix of traditional and white man's clothing, leather leggings with a cotton shirt and hat. As he drew closer, she could see he was young, perhaps in his early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. Margaret's first instinct was to call for Tommy to come inside. The relationship between the town and the Apache reservation was uneasy at best. Most whites in Clearwater Springs viewed the Apache with suspicion and fear, despite the fact that they had been peaceful neighbors for over a decade. But something in this man's careful, respectful approach made her pause. He stopped at her fence and removed his hat. "Ma'am," he said in clear, unaccented English, "I'm looking for a place to stay. Mr. Henley at the general store said you might have a room available." Margaret set down her basket of wet clothes and wiped her hands on her apron. "You're from the reservation?" "Yes, ma'am. My name is Joseph Two Eagles. I'm a translator for the Indian agent, and I have business in town for the next few weeks." She studied his face, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the respectful way he held himself. "The other boarding houses in town won't take me," he finished simply. Mr. Henley was honest about that. He said you might be more understanding. Margaret felt a familiar stab of recognition. She knew what it was like to be turned away, to be judged before people even spoke to you. "I have a room available," she said finally. "It's small, but it's clean. $2 a week, meals included." Relief flashed across Joseph's features. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your kindness." As he gathered his belongings from his horse, Tommy came running around the corner of the house, chasing a barn cat. He stopped short when he saw Joseph, his eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. Joseph knelt down to the boy's level. "Hello there," he said gently. "What's your name?" "Tommy," the boy said, studying Joseph's braids with fascination. "Are you an Indian?" "Tommy," Margaret scolded, but Joseph raised a hand with a smile. "It's all right. Yes, I am. I'm Apache. What are you?" Tommy considered this seriously. "I'm just Tommy. Mama Margaret takes care of me." Joseph's eyes flicked to Margaret with new understanding. He had assumed the boy was her natural son, but something in the child's phrasing suggested otherwise. "She seems like a very good mama," he said. That evening at dinner, Margaret served Joseph along with her other 3 boarders, a traveling salesman, an elderly prospector, and a young clerk from the bank. The conversation was stilted at first, with the other men clearly uncomfortable sharing a table with an Apache. But Joseph's quiet dignity and obvious education gradually eased the tension. He spoke of his work translating for government officials, his knowledge of both Apache and white customs, and his hope for peace between their peoples. The traveling salesman, emboldened by drink, eventually asked the question that had been hovering over the table. "Why aren't you living on the reservation like the rest of your people?" Joseph's expression remained calm. "I go where my work takes me. Right now, that's here. The Indian agent needs someone who can communicate with both the Apache Council and the white authorities in Santa Fe. Treaties are complicated things." "Still seems strange," the prospector muttered. "You talk like a white man, but you look like what I am," Joseph said simply. "I was educated at a mission school. But I am Apache. Both things are true." Margaret found herself admiring his composure. She had grown tired of explaining herself to people who would never understand, but Joseph seemed to have found a way to be proud of who he was while still functioning in a world that often rejected him. After dinner, as she was cleaning the kitchen, Joseph appeared with his empty plate. "Let me help you with the dishes, ma'am." Margaret looked at him in surprise. "That's not necessary, Mr. Two Eagles. Please call me Joseph, and it's no trouble. You've shown me kindness today. I'd like to return it." As they worked side by side, washing and drying the dishes, Margaret found herself relaxing for the first time in months. Joseph worked efficiently and without complaint, and when Tommy wandered into the kitchen for a drink of water, Joseph lifted the boy up so he could reach the pump handle. "Heavy little fellow," Joseph said with a smile, setting Tommy down. "Mama Margaret says I'm going to be big and strong," Tommy announced proudly. "I'm sure you will be," Joseph agreed. "Your mama seems very wise." After Tommy had been tucked into bed, Margaret and Joseph sat on the front porch, listening to the sounds of the evening. The town was quiet, except for the distant piano music from the saloon and the occasional bark of a dog. "Thank you again for the room," Joseph said. "I know it couldn't have been an easy decision." Margaret rocked slowly in her chair. "People should be judged by their actions, not their appearance," she said simply. Joseph glanced at her, noting the weariness in her voice. "Has it been difficult? Raising the boy alone?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Tommy's not mine by birth," she said finally. "Someone left him with me 3 years ago. I've never regretted taking him in, but—" She trailed off, unsure why she was confiding in this near stranger. "But it's hard to be different in a small town," Joseph finished. "Yes," she whispered. "People here have very definite ideas about how things should be. A woman like me, unmarried, caring for a child that isn't hers, it makes them uncomfortable." "Their discomfort is not your responsibility," Joseph said gently. "You're giving that boy a loving home. That matters more than what people think." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had said anything kind to her, had seen past her size and circumstances to the person underneath. "Thank you," she managed. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out overhead. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel quite so alone in the world. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn as usual to start breakfast for her boarders. She was surprised to find Joseph already in the kitchen, stoking the fire in the stove. "You don't need to do that," she protested. "I'm used to rising early," he said, and I couldn't sleep knowing you were working while I lay in bed." As the days passed, Joseph fell into the routine of the boarding house as if he had always been there. He helped with heavy lifting, played with Tommy in the evenings, and treated Margaret with a respect and kindness she had never experienced from a man. The other boarders gradually accepted his presence, and even some of the townspeople began nodding to him on the street. But Margaret noticed the looks they received when Joseph walked with her to the general store or when he sat on the porch in the evenings. The whispers that had always followed her now included speculation about her relationship with that Apache. She tried not to let it bother her, but the weight of their judgment was growing heavier each day. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Joseph brought up the subject that had been hanging between them. "The townspeople are talking," he said quietly. Margaret's hands stilled on her mending. "They always talk. This is different. They think you and I—" He let the words hang in the air. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I know what they think. Does it trouble you?" Margaret looked at him, this man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. "What troubles me is that they assume the worst about everything I do. If I help a neighbor, I must have ulterior motives. If I raise a child who isn't mine, I must be hiding something shameful. And now, if I treat a decent man with common courtesy, I must be—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "What would you do?" Joseph asked carefully. "If their assumptions were true." Margaret's needle slipped, pricking her finger. She sucked the small wound, using the moment to gather her thoughts. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Margaret O'Sullivan, that you are one of the finest women I've ever met. You work harder than most men. You've opened your home and heart to a child who needed you, and you've shown me kindness when no one else would. In my culture, a woman like you would be treasured." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "Joseph, you don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying. I've watched you for 2 weeks now. I've seen how you care for everyone under your roof, how gentle you are with Tommy, how strong you are in the face of this town's cruelty. You think because you're built differently than other women that you're somehow less worthy of love and respect. But you're wrong." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. "No one has ever— I've never—" She couldn't find the words. "The people in this town are fools," Joseph said firmly. "They see only what's on the surface. They can't see the beautiful heart that beats inside you." Margaret stood abruptly, her mending falling to the porch floor. "I should check on Tommy," she mumbled, and fled into the house. But as she stood in the darkened hallway, listening to the sound of Joseph's boots on the porch boards, she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to be treasured. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Margaret's boarding house. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, the preacher's wife and self-appointed moral guardian of Clearwater Springs, stood on the front porch with 2 other church ladies flanking her like sentries. Margaret dried her hands on her apron before opening the door, her stomach already knotting with dread. "Margaret," Mrs. Hartwell said without preamble, her voice crisp with disapproval. "We need to talk." Margaret stepped aside to let them in, though every instinct told her to slam the door. The 3 women arranged themselves in her small parlor like judges at a trial. Mrs. Hartwell, a thin woman with graying hair, pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin, folded her hands in her lap and fixed Margaret with a stern stare. "We're concerned about the influence you're having on young Tommy," she began. "A child needs proper guidance, and frankly, the way you're living—" She gestured vaguely around the room. "It's not appropriate." "Tommy is well cared for," Margaret said carefully. "He's healthy, happy, and learning his letters." "That's not what we mean, and you know it," Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, interjected. "Having that Apache man living under the same roof as an impressionable child? People are talking, Margaret." Margaret felt her face flush. "Mr. Two Eagles is a paying boarder, nothing more. He's educated, respectful, and kinder to Tommy than most men in this town." "That's exactly the problem," Mrs. Hartwell said sharply. "You're allowing yourself and that child to become too familiar with his kind. It's unnatural, Margaret. Wrong." Before Margaret could respond, the front door opened and Joseph entered, returning from his morning business in town. He stopped short when he saw the ladies, his expression immediately guarded. Margaret could see him taking in the tension in the room, the way the church ladies recoiled slightly from his presence. "Ladies," he said politely, removing his hat, "I apologize for interrupting." "You're not interrupting," Margaret said quickly. "These ladies were just leaving." But Mrs. Hartwell stood her ground. "Actually, Mr. Two Eagles, is it? Perhaps you could help us understand something." "Surely you realize that your presence here is causing talk. As a Christian woman, Mrs. O'Sullivan has a reputation to maintain." Joseph's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, ma'am. I pay my rent on time, keep to myself, and treat everyone in this house with respect." "It's not about respect," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shrill. "It's about propriety, about what's right and natural." "And what would you suggest?" Joseph asked, his voice deceptively calm. "That I sleep in the stable? That I find lodging somewhere else, even though every other establishment in town has turned me away?" "Perhaps," Mrs. Hartwell said coldly. "You should consider whether your business here is so important that it's worth damaging a woman's reputation." Margaret saw something flicker in Joseph's eyes. Hurt, perhaps, or resignation. She had seen that look before in her own mirror, the expression of someone who had grown accustomed to being unwanted. "That's enough," Margaret said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Mr. Two Eagles is a guest in my home, and I won't have him spoken to that way. If you have concerns about my household, you can address them with me directly." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes narrowed. "We're trying to help you, Margaret, but if you choose to ignore our counsel—" She stood, smoothing her skirts. "Come, ladies. We've said what we came to say." After they left, Margaret and Joseph stood in the parlor, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, Joseph spoke. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I should find somewhere else to stay." "No," Margaret said immediately. "This is my house, and you're welcome here as long as you want to stay." But she could see the doubt in his eyes, and it broke her heart. That afternoon, while Margaret was hanging laundry, she heard voices from the backyard. Peering around the corner, she saw Tommy sitting cross-legged in the dirt, while Joseph taught him to weave grass into small animals. The Apache man's large hands moved with surprising delicacy as he showed the boy how to twist and fold the stems. "My grandmother taught me this when I was your age," Joseph was saying. "She said it was important to make something beautiful every day, even if it was small." "Can you teach me to make a horse?" Tommy asked eagerly. "We'll start with a bird," Joseph smiled. "Horses are trickier." Margaret watched them together, her chest tight with emotion. Tommy had never had a man in his life who paid him such gentle attention. His face glowed with concentration as he tried to copy Joseph's movements, and when his first attempt fell apart, Joseph patiently helped him start again. "The secret," Joseph said, "is not to pull too tight. You have to trust the grass to hold itself together." "Like people?" Tommy asked with the startling insight that children sometimes possessed. Joseph paused in his weaving. "Yes," he said quietly. "Like people." That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed clutching his grass bird, Margaret found Joseph on the porch. He was staring out at the desert beyond the town, his expression thoughtful. "He's a special boy," Joseph said without turning around. "Yes, he is." Margaret settled into her chair beside him. "Thank you for spending time with him. He doesn't have many people who—" who see him as more than a burden, Joseph finished. Margaret nodded. The church ladies think I'm unfit to raise him because I'm not married. They've suggested more than once that he'd be better off in an orphanage. And what do you think? I think Tommy belongs with someone who loves him, Margaret said fiercely. Marriage doesn't guarantee that. They sat quietly for a while, listening to the evening sounds. Finally, Joseph spoke again. In my tribe, family isn't just about blood. Children belong to the whole community. If something happened to their parents, there would always be someone to take them in, someone to love them. What you've done for Tommy, it's not strange to me. It's what good people do. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. The white world doesn't see it that way. The white world has many rules about how people should live, Joseph said carefully. Not all of them make sense. Over the next few days, the pressure from the town continued to mount. Margaret noticed how conversations stopped when she entered the general store, how other women crossed the street to avoid her. Even Mr. Henley, who had always been cordial, seemed uncomfortable when she came to buy supplies. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon when Margaret took Tommy to the town picnic. It was an annual event that she usually avoided, but Tommy had been begging to go, and she couldn't bear to disappoint him. They had been there less than an hour when she overheard Mrs. Patterson talking to a group of women by the cake table. It's gotten worse since that Apache moved in, Mrs. Patterson was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering. Poor little Tommy is being exposed to God knows what kind of influence. Someone should notify the territorial authorities. About what? Asked Mrs. Miller, the doctor's wife. About an unfit guardian, Mrs. Patterson said primly. A woman living in sin with a savage, raising a child who isn't even hers. It's a scandal. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She grabbed Tommy's hand, preparing to leave when she heard another voice join the conversation. That's quite enough. Margaret turned to see Joseph approaching the group of women, his face set with quiet determination. Several men in the crowd had noticed the commotion and were moving closer, their expressions hostile. You have something to say, Apache? One of the men called out. It was Jack Morrison, a rancher known for his hot temper and his hatred of the local tribes. Joseph ignored him, addressing Mrs. Patterson directly. Ma'am, you seem to have some misconceptions about Mrs. O'Sullivan and her household that I'd like to correct. I don't need to hear anything from the likes of you, Mrs. Patterson sniffed. Maybe not, Joseph agreed, but you need to hear the truth. Mrs. O'Sullivan runs the finest boarding house in this territory. She works harder than any 3 people I know. She's given a loving home to a child who needed one, and she's treated me with more Christian kindness than I've received from anyone else in this town. That's a pretty speech, Jack Morrison sneered, but it doesn't change what you are. You're right, Joseph said, turning to face him. I'm Apache. I'm also educated, employed by the United States government, and a man who pays his debts and keeps his word. If that's not enough for you, the failing is yours, not mine. The crowd was growing larger now, and Margaret could feel the ugly mood building. She pulled Tommy closer to her, wishing she could make them both invisible. The point is, Mrs. Patterson said loudly, that decent women don't take in strange men, regardless of their qualifications. It's not proper. Then I suppose, Joseph said quietly, that we should make it proper. He turned to Margaret, and for a moment the entire crowd faded away. There was only Joseph's dark eyes, steady and sure, and the question she saw there. Margaret O'Sullivan, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent gathering. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The gasp that went up from the crowd was audible. Margaret felt the ground tilt under her feet. Joseph, she whispered, you don't have to. I'm not asking because I have to, he said, stepping closer. I'm asking because I want to, because I've never met anyone like you, and I can't imagine my life without you and Tommy in it." "You barely know me," Margaret protested, aware that every person at the picnic was straining to hear their conversation. "I know that you get up before dawn every day to make sure your boarders have hot coffee. I know that you sing to Tommy when you think no one can hear. I know that you judge people by their hearts, not their appearances. I know that you're the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I've ever met." Tears were streaming down Margaret's face now. "People will never accept it. A woman like me with a man like you—" "Let them talk," Joseph said firmly. "We'll build our own family, our own life. You, me, and Tommy. What anyone else thinks doesn't matter." Margaret looked around at the crowd of faces, some shocked, some disgusted, some merely curious. Then she looked down at Tommy, who was gazing up at Joseph with something like worship in his young eyes. "Mama Margaret," Tommy said in his piping voice, "can Joseph be my papa?" The simple question, asked with such innocent hope, shattered the last of Margaret's resistance. She looked up at Joseph, this man who had seen past everything the world found wrong with her, and made her choice. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Then, louder. "Yes, I'll marry you." The explosion of voices from the crowd was immediate. Some outraged, some scandalized, some simply stunned. But Margaret only had eyes for Joseph, who stepped forward and gently took her hands in his. "We'll do this right," he said quietly, for her ears only. "Church wedding if you want it. Let no one say we're ashamed of what we're choosing." As they walked away from the picnic, Tommy skipping between them, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. The road ahead would be difficult. She had no illusions about that. But for the first time in her life, she wouldn't be walking it alone. Behind them, the voices of the town rose and fell like waves. But Margaret didn't look back. She was too busy looking forward, toward a future she had never dared to imagine. The wedding was set for the following month, much to the horror of Clearwater Springs proper society. Margaret had expected Pastor Hartwell to refuse to perform the ceremony, but Joseph surprised her by approaching Father Miguel at the small Catholic mission on the edge of town instead. The elderly priest, who had spent his life ministering to both Apache and Mexican families, welcomed them with open arms. "Love is a gift from God," Father Miguel told them during their first meeting. "I don't presume to question his choices about where he places it." The weeks leading up to the wedding were difficult. Several of Margaret's longtime boarders found excuses to leave, and new ones were hard to come by. The general store began charging her higher prices for supplies, claiming there were additional costs for delivery. Some mornings she would find garbage thrown in her yard or crude words chalked on her fence. But for every door that closed, another seemed to open. Dr. Miller's wife, a quiet woman who had always been kind to Margaret, began recommending the boarding house to travelers passing through. A Mexican family who ran a small ranch outside of town started bringing their eggs and vegetables to trade for meals. Even some of the Apache from the reservation, curious about one of their own who was marrying into white society, began stopping by to meet Joseph's intended bride. Margaret was initially nervous around these visitors, but she quickly discovered that they treated her with more respect and warmth than most of the white townspeople ever had. The women, in particular, seemed to understand her situation in a way that surprised her. "Among our people," explained Maria, an older Apache woman who spoke excellent English, "a woman's worth is not measured by her size or whether she was married young. We see your strength, how you care for the child, how you work. These are good things." Joseph's family from the reservation also came to visit. His mother, a dignified woman named Bluebird Woman, studied Margaret with intelligent dark eyes before nodding her approval. "My son chooses well," she said simply. "You have a generous heart." Tommy thrived in this environment of acceptance. The Apache visitors taught him words in their language, showed him how to track animals, and treated him like any other beloved child. He began to stand straighter, speak more confidently, and for the first time in his young life, he seemed to feel that he truly belonged somewhere. The wedding ceremony itself was small but beautiful. Margaret wore a dress of deep blue that she had sewn herself, and Joseph wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with white formal wear. Tommy stood between them during the ceremony, beaming as if he had personally arranged their happiness. Father Miguel spoke about love transcending boundaries and building bridges between different worlds. Only a handful of people from town attended: Dr. and Mrs. Miller, the elderly woman who ran the telegraph office, and surprisingly, Mr. Henley from the general store. But Joseph's Apache family filled the small mission, their presence lending dignity and joy to the occasion. After the ceremony, they held a celebration at the boarding house. The Apache families brought traditional foods and music, creating a feast unlike anything Clearwater Springs had ever seen. As the sun set, Joseph took Margaret's hand and led her onto the porch for their first dance as husband and wife. There was no fiddle music, just the sound of Apache drums and singing, but Margaret had never felt more beautiful or loved. "No regrets?" Joseph asked as they swayed together in the lamplight. "None," Margaret said firmly. "Not about any of it." Their first months of marriage were an adjustment, but a happy one. Joseph proved to be everything Margaret had hoped: a kind, hard-working husband who shared domestic duties without complaint and treated Tommy like his own son. He taught the boy Apache words and customs while also helping him with his reading and arithmetic. In the evenings, he would tell stories from his childhood, weaving together Apache legends with tales of his experiences in the white world. Margaret, meanwhile, discovered that marriage brought out a confidence in her she hadn't known existed. With Joseph's steady support and obvious love, she began to stand up to the town's prejudice more directly. When Mrs. Patterson made a snide comment at the general store about that unnatural arrangement, Margaret looked her straight in the eye and said, "My marriage is blessed by God and recognized by law. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you take it up with him." The boarding house began to thrive again as word spread through traveling networks about the unique hospitality offered there. Traders, government officials, and even some adventurous families began specifically seeking out Margaret's establishment. Her ability to communicate with both white and Apache communities made her place valuable for anyone doing business in the territory. Joseph's work as a translator also expanded. His reputation for fairness and intelligence spread, and he was increasingly called upon to help mediate disputes and facilitate negotiations. The combination of his income and Margaret's boarding house business made them more prosperous than either had ever been alone. But it was the unexpected addition to their family that truly cemented their happiness. A year after their wedding, Margaret discovered she was carrying Joseph's child. At 30, she had assumed motherhood was beyond her, and the news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. "What if people say terrible things about the baby?" she worried to Joseph one evening as they sat on their porch, her hand resting on her barely visible belly. "People will always find things to say," Joseph replied, covering her hand with his own. "Our child will know love and acceptance from the start. That's what matters." Tommy was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a big brother. He spent hours talking to Margaret's belly, telling the baby about all the things they would do together. "I'll teach him to make grass animals," he announced importantly, "and Papa Joseph can show him how to track rabbits." When little Sarah was born, she came into the world during one of the worst blizzards in territorial history. Dr. Miller couldn't make it through the snow, so Maria and Bluebird Woman attended the birth, their calm competence seeing both mother and baby safely through. Sarah entered the world with her father's dark hair and her mother's blue eyes, a perfect blend of both her parents' heritage. The townspeople's reaction to the baby was mixed. Some continued their hostility, but others found it harder to maintain their prejudice in the face of a sweet-natured infant. Children, especially, seemed immune to adult prejudices, and soon Tommy had friends who came to play at the boarding house, where they would beg Joseph to tell them stories and show them Apache games. As Sarah grew into a toddler with her mother's determined spirit and her father's quick intelligence, the family's place in the community gradually shifted. They would never be fully accepted by everyone, but they had carved out their own space, built their own network of friends and allies. The boarding house became known throughout the territory as a place where anyone could find welcome, regardless of their background. Margaret often marveled at how her life had changed. She still worked hard, still faced challenges, but she was no longer alone. She had a partner who valued her strength, children who loved her unconditionally, and a community of people who had chosen to embrace rather than reject difference. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching Joseph teach Tommy and Sarah how to identify constellations, Margaret reflected on the words that had started it all. "No one weds a large woman, sir, but I can care for your child." She had been wrong about the first part, she realized. Someone had married her, someone who saw her worth and chose to build a life with her. And she had been right about the second part, though in ways she never could have imagined. "What are you thinking about?" Joseph asked, settling beside her after the children had gone to bed. "About how wrong people can be," Margaret said. "About assumptions and judgments and the things we tell ourselves about what's possible." Joseph nodded, understanding immediately. "When I first came to this town, I expected to be turned away from every door. I never imagined I would find a home here, a family." "The church ladies were right about one thing," Margaret said with a small smile. "We are an unnatural arrangement. We don't fit any of their rules about how families should be formed or what they should look like." "And yet here we are," Joseph said, pulling her closer. 3 years later, still together, still happy, still scandalizing the good people of Clearwater Springs, Margaret added with a laugh. "Let them be scandalized," Joseph said firmly. "We've built something beautiful here, something real. That's worth more than their approval." As if summoned by their conversation, Tommy appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt. "Mama? Papa? I had a dream." "Come here, son," Joseph said, opening his arms. Tommy climbed into his lap, and Margaret shifted to make room for all of them in the big porch chair. "What kind of dream?" Margaret asked, smoothing Tommy's sandy hair. "I dreamed I was grown up and had children of my own," Tommy said sleepily. "And I told them about how you and Papa found each other, and how we became a family even though people said we couldn't." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "And what did your dream children say?" Tommy yawned. "They said it was the best story they ever heard, because it had a happy ending." As they sat there together under the star-filled sky, the Apache man, the large white woman, and the boy who belonged to both of them, Margaret thought about endings and beginnings, about the courage it took to love someone the world said you shouldn't, and about the families that formed not through blood or convention, but through choice and determination and hope. Years later, when Tommy was grown and had children of his own, when Sarah had become a teacher who welcomed all kinds of students, and when Margaret and Joseph had celebrated their silver wedding anniversary, people would still talk about how their unlikely marriage had changed Clearwater Springs. Some would say it was for the better. Others would maintain their disapproval, but no one could deny that love had triumphed over prejudice in ways that mattered. The boarding house still stands today, now run by Sarah's daughter, still welcoming travelers of all kinds, and on quiet evenings, if you listen carefully, you might still hear the echo of an Apache man's voice saying, "Then stay," and a woman's whispered response, "Yes." It was, after all, the beginning of everything that mattered. In the end, Margaret learned that being treasured had nothing to do with fitting into other people's expectations and everything to do with finding someone who could see the treasure that was already there. And Joseph discovered that home wasn't a place on a map, but wherever love was offered and accepted without conditions. They had proven that families could be built in the most unexpected ways, that love could bridge any gap, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories began with someone having the courage to say, "You belong here, with me." In a world that tried to divide them, they had chosen unity. In a society that demanded conformity, they had celebrated difference. And in doing so, they had created something lasting and true, a legacy of love that would echo through generations, reminding anyone who heard their story that the heart knows no boundaries save those we place on it ourselves.